A couple of weeks ago, I was a delegate from my SU to the National Union of Students National Conference. We debated Motion Proposal 701, which sought to balance gender on conference floor. Despite women making up 60% of NUS membership, last year only 30% of delegates were women, although this year the figure was 40%. The motion proposal wanted to ensure that all member unions have to send an equal amount of men and women to conference. As part of the debate around the motion, a number of points were raised that I think might be worth talking about. So here goes. Number 1. Quotas are not patronising. A number of women made the point that with quotas, some women at conference might feel that they'd been elected on the basis of their gender rather than their policy, and that this is patronising. Here's the first thing. The mandate that any delegate at NUS has is horrifically flimsy at best. First, hardly any students vote in delegate elections. Second, in our brief statement that we're elected on, we by no means articulate our stance on the incredibly broad range of policies that we're expected to vote on at conference. I know that I made a brief statement of why I believed NUS conference is important, and then outlined as laconically as possible my basic experience. If those who opposed the gender balancing motion think that I was elected on the basis of my policy, they are delusional. In no way did my brief profile indicate how I might vote on a motion about free education, let alone my position on offender learning policy in FE colleges, boycotting the NSS, or abolishing NUS zones, to name a few that we were asked to vote on. Ergo, a gender quota would not be patronising in shifting the validity of our delegacy from policy to gender, since our delegacy as it stands is far from democratically legitimate. So number 2, quotas work. In Sheffield last year, we almost sent a delegation to National Conference of 7 men plus our president, also a man. In response to this, our women's officer at the time brought a motion that we instigate a gender balancing policy. Our delegation this year was 4 women and 3 men plus our president, a man. So quite clearly, on the numbers, quotas work. We're a union which is 54% women. In what universe is it democratically representative to send a delegation which is 100% men? But it's not just about the numbers. The figures show that 3 out of 4 of our women delegates this year would have been elected irregardless of the quota. So what does that mean? Firstly, it means that only 1 of 4 women delegates was elected on her gender rather than her policy. But it also indicates that because structural inequality exists, women are sometimes put off from running for something because they perceive their gender as a barrier to their success. Quotas are a way of restricting that structural inequality by placing an alternative structure in its place. Interestingly, when asked whether they would have stood without the quotas, most, but not all, of the women candidates for election said that they would have stood anyway. But that doesn't mean that women in future years who may not have stood previously might stand now having seen a woman win as a direct result of the quota. Number 3, the NUS already uses quotas. At NUS liberation conferences, there are national quotas in place. For example, at NUS Women's Conference, at least 1 delegate from each union must define as black, and 1 is either LGBT or disabled. Similarly, at NUS LGBT Conference, at least 1 delegate from each union must define as black, 1 as trans star, and 3 as women. So the point made by 1 delegate against Motion 701 at National Conference, that it should be down to individual unions to decide independently whether to gender balance their delegation, is laughable when NUS, as a supposedly progressive and liberation-friendly organisation, has already made similar, nationally applicable structural changes elsewhere. Number 4, liberation facilitates further liberation. One of the points that was made at conference which really bothered me was the suggestion that by instigating a gender quota we would be placing the women's campaign at some kind of an advantage over other liberation campaigns. Here's the thing. Women are a majority in NUS. We are 60% of its membership. The fact that last year only 30% of conference floor self-defined as women is embarrassing, but the point made that this is democratically legitimate and a situation void of structural inequality is, frankly, insulting. These figures mean that only half of the actual proportion of women in NUS were represented on conference floor. That's not just an accident of democracy. And this is far from the case for other liberation campaigns. In fact, the figures which the Democratic Procedures Committee presented at conference this year revealed that conference floor is roughly representative for all 3 of the other NUS liberation campaigns. Why then, in a progressive institution, is it acceptable to have such appalling misrepresentation of women? Strong and progressive moves for one liberation group necessarily have positive knock-on effects for all other campaigns. It's called smashing the kyriarchy. Number 5. Conference is supposed to be representative. NUS National Conference is the largest collaboration of NUS membership from across the whole of the UK, and as such it's important that it comes as close as possible to representing the diversity of that membership. We wouldn't stand for it if one of the nations wasn't represented at conference. We wouldn't stand for it if international students, postgrad students or FE college students were not represented. We would not stand for it if black students, disabled students or LGBT students were drastically underrepresented. We're starting to realise that it might be problematic that we don't necessarily represent apathetic or right-leaning students on our campuses at conference. So why did Motion 701 fall? Why are we, as a student movement, choosing to stand for the devastating underrepresentation of women at our national policy-making conference? It's called patriarchy, folks, and it ain't pretty.